happy and I feel very honored to welcome you to a very special lecture today. For a small university located somewhere in the province in Eastern Germany, it's a more or less usual thing that people go out into the world and, for example, go to New Haven, Yale University for a certain time for studying there or doing their research. So that's not the big thing, but I think it is a very different thing when people from Yale University, New Haven, come and visit the Viadrina here very much in the province of Eastern Germany. And I'm very, very happy and proud and honored that Jeffrey Alexander made this way and is here at Viadrina for a wonderful conference and also for this lecture tonight. So I'm very happy to welcome you, dear Jeffrey Alexander, to Viadrina once again. When people start studying something like the structure of society and they ask themselves in their research, what is it that brings people together, but also maybe that divides? What is the basis of a certain maybe collective identity, of factual identities, of integration, of disintegration? Then further or later, they will definitely read maybe the most prominent book written by Jeffrey Alexander, which is The Civil Sphere. Civil Sphere theory, which evolved from this monumental and very important book, is of course, and I think this is a common misunderstanding, it's not about civil society, but it is about, let's say, the civility in society. It is about the idea what brings societies together, what might structure them, and what is very important, it is about the idea which role emotions, interpretations, belongings, identities play in the evolution, let's say, of a society. And so the civil sphere, Alexander argues, is a certain sphere of abstract solidarity, a sphere which is made upon or from this we-ness, a sense of we-ness that holds and brings a society together. And what we here at Viadrina quite often discuss, also in the conference at this, in these days here, and I think which will be a topic for tonight's lecture as well, is the question, how are these structuring processes, the structures of feelings of emotions going on in the region that is very close to Viadrina, or that Viadrina is even a part of, and that is the Central and East European region with this very difficult, complex societal legacies, histories, and of course also presence that is not very easy, in particular when we are looking on Ukraine. And therefore, I am very happy that tonight we will have an enlightening speech, I'm sure, about the civil society in war and peace. And Jeffrey Alexander took that title with the subtitle From Athens to Kiev. So let's see what we can learn about this long history and about the role of the civil society in war and peace. Jeffrey Alexander is the Lillian Chavenson Saden Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Yale University at the Center for Cultural Sociology, which he's also the director of. He has written an immense amount of books and articles, of course, on the civil sphere, also on radicalisms in the civil sphere, on trauma, on societalization of social problems, for example. And so he has very deep insight into these very basic processes that made up and make up our societies, even in very complex situations. And now I'm very, very happy once again. Welcome to Viadrina. We feel extremely honored. And dear Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm sure I'll disappoint you after that introduction. So, but I am honored to be here. I'm one of the most beautiful university buildings that I've ever lectured in. So it's a pleasure. But the topic of the paper is pretty dark, so it contrasts with the beauty of the building. The episodic millennia-long process of constructing a civil sphere represents humankind's most creative and courageous effort to control violence and undermine domination. By constructing a broad civil form of solidarity and by creating institutions that can effectively represent it. In my lecture today, I wish to explore the paradoxical nature of civil spheres, their democratic promise, and the tragedies that lay scarcely concealed beneath them. Violence has been a primary form of group relationship throughout human history. Nature red in tooth and claw, in Hobbes' famous phrase. Aggression rather than cooperation. War rather than peaceful comedy. Violence splits self from other, breaking extant bonds and preventing new ones from emerging. Violence eliminates communal ties, isolating individuals one from another. Nonviolent relationships, whether conflictual or cooperative, can be created only if civil bonds reach between otherwise separated parties. The possibility for creating a civil sphere rests upon a series of what, from a realist perspective, might be called utopian conceits. That people are independent rather than dependent. That they are critical rather than deferential. That people are honest rather than deceitful. That people are open rather than secretive. That they're cooperative rather than aggressive. Altruistic rather than selfish. Autonomous, yet deeply interested in others' well-being. Only if the motives of our fellow citizens and their relations are conceived in such a hopeful manner can we imagine the kind of civil solidarity that makes democracy possible. The trustful yet critical connection with one another that allows deliberation rather than domination, that envisions respectful pluralism and sustains the democratic faith. The paradox is that the very process of imagining such a world that sacralizes qualities like civility, autonomy, and cooperation, requires us at the very same time to construct an imaginary world that is its very opposite, one that is anti-civil and profane. For we can only understand good by comparing it with evil. We can only sacralize the civil if we are simultaneously able to pollute the profane. Honesty must be related to dishonesty, rationality to irrationality, altruism to egoism, autonomy to dependence, democracy to dictatorship. Which explains why the discourse of civil spheres is binary, and how it is that for those who inhabit them, civil spheres are experienced as fragile. Because it's natural to imagine that dark and threatening forces of anti-civility are always churning just outside of civil spheres and just beneath them as well. It is the imminent experience of danger and fragility that explains why civil spheres exclude as much as they include, why they feel compelled to energetically fight against actors and groups whose motives they imagine to be dependent and dishonest, and whose relations they imagine to be aggressive. Because if the motives of actors and the relations they form are indeed anti-civil, then it makes extended solidarity impossible and democratic self-government also impossible to sustain. This paradox at the heart of civil spheres can easily become transformed into tragic social facts. It is because they are always on the lookout for threatening anti-civility that civil spheres have frequently exercised violence against those who are outside their geopolitical boundaries. and repression against those who are within. The core groups that create civil spheres often abuse and dominate fellow members of their national communities, citizens and non-citizens alike, who are not considered to have what it takes, who are not imagined to be in possession of the sacred civil qualities that make a trusting solidarity possible, whose skin color contrasts with their own, whose gender and sexuality contrast with their own, who worship a different God, who inhabit a different social class. The binaryism of civil discourse also explains why the creation of civil spheres inside of collectivities, whether city-states or nations, so often has fueled violent war-making outside of civil spheres. In a world unregulated by supranational norms, it is immensely tempting for members of domestic civil spheres to see anti-democratic collectivities abroad as gravely threatening, which helps us understand why civil spheres have been able to legitimate viciously anti-civil violence against other putatively primitive civilizations, against other purportedly barbaric city-states, against other supposedly evil empires and nations. The final paradox that marks civil spheres is implied by the one I've just described, which is this: the civil sphere stops at the border of one's own collectivity. For the ancient Greeks and the republican city-states of the Middle Ages and early modern Europe, this meant the boundaries of their cities. For moderns, this usually means the boundaries of their nations. It is only for this reason that the civil suspicion of anti-civil outsiders leads to war. The national form of organization, in other words, has severely compromised the civil sphere's promise of universal solidarity. All of this helps, I think, to understand the wrenching predicament that Europe finds itself in today. But before approaching this contemporary crisis and the episodes of war and peace in the long 20th century that have preceded it, I wish to turn back to a much earlier time, indeed to the very first effort to construct a civil sphere in ancient Greece. Because it was from this ancient world, after all, that the democratic elements of our contemporary politics and culture derive. My aim is to shine a spotlight on the origins of the wrenching paradoxes that I've just described analytically. And I will do so not by looking directly at Greek social life, but at its dramatic art, which was much more central to the civic life of the ancients than it is to our civic life today. Western civilization has its origins in the efforts of Greeks, beginning in the late 6th century BCE, to create a form of social organization that would move beyond the endless cycle of violence, revenge, particularism, and domination that for centuries had made the Peloponnese a very dangerous place to live. In the Iliad, the extraordinary poem composed centuries earlier, Homer valorized violence, revenge, tribal honor, and physical courage. Functioning as an ur-text for Greeks in the centuries that followed, Homer's epic narrated the 10th year of a vicious war that the Greeks, or the Achaeans as he called them, were waging against the much wealthier and much more cultured city of Troy. Homer's cast of hero kings and their bonded soldiers had sailed across the Aegean Sea to punish and pillage Troy. Why? By reason of a wound to their masculine vanity. Paris, the son of Troy's king, had kidnapped a Greek princess named Helen, the proverbial beauty, quote, whose face launched 1,000 ships. Achilles, petulant, stubborn, courageous, virulently angry, and unutterably violent, was the Greeks' greatest fighter, a sulking macho hero who was not only the pivot of Homer's narrative, but of the Trojan War itself. When fleet-footed Achilles finally agreed to leave his tents and re-engage in the war, he murdered Hector, the Trojans' greatest fighter. Homer sketched a scene of gruesome violence, a murder that concluded with Achilles, the blood-stained and crazed Greek warrior hero, roping Hector's feet to the back of his chariot and dragging the dead Trojan's body round and round the walls of Troy, so that the mother, father, children, and fellow citizens of his vanquished enemy were forced to bear terrible witness to the physical and metaphysical desecration of Hector's body. Hector embodied hearth, home, and urban civility. Achilles represented bloodletting, male honor, revenge, and cycles of violence without end. 300 years after the creation of Homer's war poem, the tables had turned. The Greeks were themselves busy building wealthy and sophisticated cities, Athens the most powerful and cultivated among them. In the Greek utopian imagination, their new city would suppress bloodlust and tribal particularism, creating a radically new ethos, one organized around civility, cooperation, law, and democracy. The first of the great Greek tragedians was named Aeschylus. He was a teenager in 509 BC when Athenians expelled the monarchical family ruling them and established in its place the world's first democratic government. Aeschylus spent his mature life in the glory days of Athenian self-rule. In the Oresteia, the last three-play cycle of his storied career, Aeschylus dramatized the triumph of law over revenge, peace over bloodletting, and self-government over tyranny. The first two plays of the Oresteia unfolded in the countryside, narrating a tragic cycle of murder, bloodlust, revenge, and murder again. To appease the gods who had been preventing the Greeks from setting sail for Troy, King Agamemnon, the Greek king, ignored the heart-rending pleas of his wife Clytemnestra and publicly sacrificed the life of their daughter, Iphigenia, and killed her with his own hand. When 10 years later, Agamemnon returned victorious from Troy, he himself was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra. And not many years later, Clytemnestra herself was murdered in cold blood by Orestes, her son with Agamemnon. Talk about cycles of violence and revenge. The Furies, ancient goddesses of death and underworld, were determined not to let Orestes get away with the murder of his mother. So they planned his murder, reiterating the Homeric case for violence. I'm quoting now from Aeschylus, quote, "We are the angry ones," the Furies proudly announce. Quote, "Fear is good. It must keep its watchful place at the heart's controls. There is advantage in the wisdom won from pain." Indeed, the Furies ridicule the very idea of civil peace. Quote, "In the city, if the man rears a heart that nowhere goes in fear, how shall such a one any more respect the right?" The Furies propose an ethic that could not be more different. It's the morality of an eye for an eye. And I'm quoting now from the lines of the play with the Fury statements. "Here is anger for anger. He who has done shall suffer. That is the law. The spoiler is robbed. The killer he has paid. There is only fierce anger and burdened hatred. The cure for this is raw, brutal bloodshed. War strength shall collide with war strength. Fearing his death at the hands of such vengeful goddesses, Orestes flees from the bloody countryside to the city of Athens, planting himself in front of Athena's temple gates. How Athena deals with the fate of her guest is the topic of the Eumenides, the Oresteia last third and final play. Athena immediately takes the matter in hand, embarking on a pathway that will lead to a new, more universalizing standard of justice. She admonishes the Furies that they have given, quote, only half the argument, insisting there are two sides here. The Furies respond sarcastically, telling Athena, go examine him then yourself, and warning her, but be fair about it. Athena does just this. She addresses Orestes, saying, your turn, stranger. I respect your rights. The goddess of Athens then does a most astonishing thing. She establishes a trial by jury. Quote, I shall select judges and swear them in, she declares to Orestes, to the Furies, and to the chorus of older Athenians looking on. In doing so, Athena announces, I will, quote, establish a court for all time to come. What Athena has done is to create an institution that is regulatory in the conceptual language of civil sphere theory, designed to control violence on behalf of the community. An embryonic civil discourse emerges. Quote, I will pick the finest of my citizens, Athena says, and they shall swear to make no judgment that is not just, and make clear where in this action the truth lies. A member of the elderly chorus affirms the path that Athena is taking, calling on the assembled citizens to, quote, speak in defense of reason, to refuse the life of anarchy and the life devoted to one master. Athena herself characterizes the tribunal as a deliberative assembly and testifies that the process it establishes will be history's, quote, first trial for bloodshed. She announces, litigants, call your witnesses, and instructs them to have ready your proofs as evidence under bond so that your case can be fairly tried. She declares that all must stand upright, and she points to what will become another regulatory institution of Athens' civil sphere, which is the ballot. Quote, each man his ballot in his hand, Athena says, and asks the citizens on the jury to, quote, think on your oath and make your judgment. So each side presents its case, then Athena inquires, shall I assume that enough has now been said? And she tells the judges to render what they believe will be a true verdict. Apollo says yes. He addresses the citizen jury. The jury reminds the people around them of their universalizing commitments to rationality and truth. Quote, you have heard what you have heard, and as you cast your votes, good friends, respect in your hearts the oath that you have sworn to the truth. The jury votes to spare Orestes, acquitting him of, quote, the charge of blood. Athena applauds the, quote, reverence of citizens, the respect for newly civil values. And Athena tells them to go forth and govern in grace, praising the new system of justice that has just been established, quote, such as nowhere else found among men. The Furies are very angry at this. In an effort to assuage them, Athena reassures them that, as they had demanded, this was the result of a fair ballot. She then warns them, be reasonable, and says, suppress your violent ambitions. Quote, put to sleep the bitter strength in the black wave. Here's the goddess's concluding peroration, quote, not let the dry dust that drinks the black blood of citizens through passion for revenge and bloodshed be given our state to prey upon. Let them render instead grace for grace. Let love be their common will. In place of the ancient ethos of anger, domination, and bloodlust, which led to an endless cycle of violent revenge, Humanities offers Athenians a universal civil ethic, one that emphasizes truth and reason and proposes a democratic spirit of consensus and cooperation. But there is a catch. In an extraordinary example of what Aristotle would later conceptualize as anagnorisis, surprise recognition, Aeschylus goes on to dramatize what, to our contemporary perspective, is a tragic paradox that marks civil societies. What Aeschylus shows is that the civil order institutionalized inside the city is not intended to prevent violence and war from being practiced outside the city. After warning the Furies against taking revenge, Athena adds a stunning qualification. It is, quote, only in this place that we haunt, she confides, that her paean to nonviolent comedy is intended to be applied. After repeating her warning, do not inflict your bloody stimulus to twist the inward hearts of young men. Here, she adds the fine print. What she really means, she affirms, is this: do not engraft upon my citizens that spirit of war that turns their battle fury inward on themselves. Athena is not, in other words, against violence in and of itself. She means to demand civility only inside the walls of Athens. Quote, let our wars range outward, she declares, and may they range full, fierce, and terrible for those desiring high renown. War full, fierce, and terrible, just like the violence waged by the Homeric heroes of old. The message is clear. While there is to be a new and civil spirit domestically, which will sustain the new regulative institutions of democracy, the old fighting spirit, the spirit of Achilles, must continue to be projected abroad for, quote, no true fighter, she says, fights at home. Aeschylus was not only a dramatist of civil democracy, but a warrior himself and a patriot. At the age of 35, several years after his plays began to be performed, Aeschylus fought shoulder to shoulder with other Greeks to defend his city against the invading Persians, the greatest empire of that day. He was injured in the pivotal Battle of Marathon in 490, during which his brother was killed. 10 years later, Aeschylus fought in the sea battle at Salamis, when the Greeks held off the second Persian invasion. He died in 455, 3 years after the first performance of the Oresteia. The epitaph on his tomb, composed by the dramatist himself, enshrined his service as a warrior at Marathon and made no mention whatsoever of his achievements as a playwright. Throughout the entire span of the 5th century BC, there was scarcely a time when Athenian democracy was not at war, when its domestically civil citizens were not fighting ferociously and violently against invading forces from outside Greece or hostile city-states within it. By the time of Aeschylus' death in mid-century, democratic Athens, in fact, had become a bristling imperial power, dominating other Greek cities militarily and demanding tribute from them economically. But having lived by the sword, Athens would eventually die from it. It was conquered by oligarchic Sparta in 404, 2 years after the death of Euripides, the third and last of the great Greek tragedians. In marked contrast with Aeschylus and Sophocles, the great tragedian who followed him, Euripides' dramas were conspicuous for their cynicism about gods and heroes. And Euripides himself was a recluse who took little interest in public affairs, let alone in military life. The tragic paradox that clawed at the heart of Greek democracy has been recapitulated time and time again in Western history. Building upon the civil discourse and institutions of ancient Greece, the civilization it had subjugated, Rome flourished as an imperial republic. Julius Caesar returned home from his decade as governor of occupied Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, dismissed the Senate, started a civil war, and eventually declared himself dictator for life. Caesarism became a metaphor for the dark possibilities triggered by the paradoxes of actually existing civil spheres. For centuries, fears of Caesarism cast a shadow over the fragile precariousness of democratic life. You can see it referred to throughout the debates, for example, on the American Constitution. Bonapartism eventually replaced Caesarism. After French revolutionaries overthrew the ancient regime, the civil code of liberty, equality, and fraternity was briefly institutionalized. Soon after, its leaders began to see anti-civil enemies everywhere. The revolution ate its own children, and it became fatally destabilized, even as it faced anti-revolutionary military forces outside. Then a little corporal named Napoleon Bonaparte stepped in to save the day. The price was French democracy. Claiming he was defending the ideals of revolutionary France, Napoleon waged war against Europe and eventually crowned himself emperor for life. Bonapartism now became the ghost that haunted democracies. In Max Weber's later work, it became transmogrified into the ambiguous notion of charisma. The great German thinker came to believe that it was his nation's Caesarism that had caused it to lose the First World War, and that another more democratic form of charismatic domination might save Germany in the future. Now, Weber described the modern state's great achievement as its ability to pacify the nation by monopolizing the means of violence. But it is an empty promise, as the history of the 20th century sadly shows. For it was not despite, but because of state monopolization that violence continually resurfaced. Internally pacified states, especially despotisms, but as we have seen frequently also democracies, can and usually do unleash the violence that they monopolize against societies outside them, with war and imperialism the result. They also can and usually do deploy physical brutality against some elements of their own populations, with repression, genocide, and sometimes civil war the result. Despite the miasma of the first fin de siècle, most leading European and American thinkers welcomed the 20th century, believing that it would deepen enlightenment and make the world more modern, rational, and democratic. Yet from the onset of the First World War in 1914 to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, what might be called the long 20th century, modern Western societies have been involved in intensely destabilizing global conflicts. They're putatively pacific civil democracies mired deeply and passionately in ever more violent and often global wars. Each shattering episode pitted democratic against anti-democratic regimes. Authoritarian nations and empires without self-regulating civil spheres made war against democratic nations that possessed them. World War I was started by an Austrian emperor who was soon joined by a German Kaiser. World War II was started by a Nazi Führer, soon joined by a fascist El Duce, and an emperor from Japan, whose people revered him as the son of heaven. The Cold War was triggered by the imperial aggressions of a Bolshevik commissar and by the revanchist ambitions of his Chinese counterpart, the chairman of the CCP. Russia's brutal war against Ukraine was launched by a dictator whose official title is President of the Russian Federation, but whose internet meme I've discovered is translated as Bunker Grandpa, Bunker Needed, and who wields top-down power that the czars would have envied. Yet the democracies who were the victims of these tyrannical wars don't get off scot-free. The binaryism of civil discourse makes it easy for democratic citizens to hate, to make opponents into enemies, to act barbarously in the name of their civilizing mission. France, Britain, and Holland were twice victims of German militarism in the first half of the 20th century, but for centuries they themselves had been militarily menacing imperial powers, often brutally subjugating local peoples in the name of civilization. The United States, the nation that Tocqueville hailed as inventing modern democracy, wiped out the indigenous people of North America and enslaved Black Africans. And its army and navy exercised military hegemony across Latin America for 2 centuries. During the world wars of the 20th century, Americans polluted all things German, whether at home or abroad. And as Americans confronted the militarized Japanese army, the Empire of the Sun, they ardently deployed orientalizing discourse that polluted their enemies as inherently violent, duplicitous, even subhuman. Despite such mutual demonization, each of these earth-shattering and brutally violent military confrontations, when they were concluded, triggered dreams of global peace. The victors decided that to achieve pacification, civil spheres would have to be more deeply institutionalized in the conquered nations and more widely institutionalized outside of them. The dictatorships that had initiated the world wars were forcibly transformed so that their civil spheres would control their national governments. And infrastructures of international democracy were constructed, which aimed at extending the civil sphere beyond nation states for the first time. After World War I, the League of Nations. After World War II, the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe and the United Nations for the world. After the Cold War, optimism exploded about the world being united by something called globalization, and the eastern boundaries of the EU and NATO were extended until they nearly abutted Russia itself. But none of these post-war efforts to erect a supranational civil order actually managed to overcome the cultural and material realities of the nation state. The League of Nations was hobbled by nationalism, an inward-looking US refusing to join the organization that its own president had helped create. And in the interwar period, of course, the League of Nations was exploded by communism, fascism, and Nazism. The United Nations was strangled at its birth by the victor's decision to give veto power to any of the 5 members of the Security Council. The singular exception was the EU. After 1,000 years of war, Europe had finally become internally pacified, yet its governing structure was by no means internally democratic. The EU has been hobbled by democratic deficits. Critical decisions are made by unelected EU commissioners in Brussels. and the communicative and regulative institutions of the embryonic European civil sphere are non-existent or weak. Still, over the last 75 years, European nations have not made war against themselves. While there has been no global war in the last 75 years, the reason has less to do with the success of civil internationalism than the acronym MAD, mutually assured destruction. It's the rational calculation that there would be mutually assured destruction in the wake of the use of nuclear weapons that has guaranteed global peace. Yet regional war making has despoiled the global landscape of post-war, 2 million dead in almost 300 armed conflicts, with more than 50 still ongoing. Some of the most savage among them waged by one of the world's oldest electoral democracies, the United States. Think Korea, Vietnam, Persian Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan, and most recently Gaza and Iran. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it was in the first place because Ukraine, in striking contrast to Russia, had managed to sustain an independent post-Soviet civil sphere, which made it possible for Ukraine to take widely noticed steps to become formally integrated with the EU, beginning with the association agreement in 2014. These civil achievements challenged Putin's claim that Ukraine was bound to Russia by primordial bonds of national, religious, and ethnic solidarity. But there exists no global civil sphere whose elected officials could order the arrest of Russia's violent leaders and submit them to a trial by jury of their peers, with imprisonment the obvious result. As Athena had once submitted Orestes and the Furies to that first trial for bloodshed, as she called it, whose outcome, quote, put to sleep the bitter strength in the black wave in order to let love be their common will. Because there is no common democratically elected power to enforce the rule of civility, international relations resemble Hobbes' war of all against all. It is a matter of force against force. The courage and valor of Ukraine's democratically empowered citizens against Russian mercenaries and unfortunate draftees. The latter supported by Chinese, North Korean, and Iranian autocrats, the former by civil spheres of such transnational and national bodies as NATO, the US, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the Nordic nations. No, the paradox of actually existing civil spheres has not been resolved. Internally, they remain fragile, and externally, they remain delimited by the nation state. Organized violence remains not just a last resort, but a primary mode for resolving political disputes, which is to say that the 2,500 years long effort to create and empower civil spheres has not fully succeeded. Still, it seems to me that the very length of this history gives us that much more reason to keep on trying. When Vico hailed, quote, the eternal and never failing light of a truth beyond all questions, he offered this reassurance, quote, that the world of civil society has certainly been made by men, and that its principles are therefore to be found within the modifications of our own human minds. Thank you.